What do you imagine when you hear the word nun? Perhaps a woman shrouded in black and white garments, her head bowed, lips whispering prayers from dawn to dusk, her life wholly dedicated to God, untouched by the turbulence of the world outside. For centuries, this has been the image carefully constructed, the story passed down in sermons, paintings, and the collective imagination of Christendom. Yet history, when peeled back, reveals something altogether more complicated, something darker, more human, and more scandalous than many would dare to believe. In medieval Europe, monasteries and convents were supposed to be sanctuaries of purity, havens of asceticism, humility, and unwavering devotion. They were designed as fortresses against temptation, their high walls a shield against the sins of the flesh. Inside, the rhythm of daily life was governed by strict rules: prayer, fasting, service. But rules, as history so often shows, are fragile things. Behind the walls of many convents, the very ideals of chastity and obedience that defined their existence were quietly unraveled by desire, indulgence, and the unquenchable complexities of human nature. Far from being secluded worlds of silence and restraint, some nunneries became centers of intrigue and, at times, outright debauchery. It was not only whispered rumors but documented scandals, recorded by bishops, kings, and horrified chroniclers, that painted the picture of a parallel world where sacred vows blurred with carnal temptations. These convents, hidden within the fabric of European society, became theaters of forbidden drama, where the sacred and the profane intertwined in shocking ways. And strangely, each country seemed to cultivate its own peculiar form of scandal. Italy, with its sensuous culture and mercantile opulence, produced convents that transformed into clandestine brothels hidden beneath pious facades. Spain, torn between fervent Catholic discipline and the irresistible draw of human passion, saw its nunneries gain infamous nicknames tied to their vices. France, the so-called land of love, birthed bacchanalian feasts within monastic walls, echoing the wild revelries of ancient Rome. Germany, in its stern pursuit of order, responded with punishments so severe they bordered on the macabre. The irony is palpable. The very institutions designed to contain temptation often became breeding grounds for it. And the stories left behind, stories of passion, hypocrisy, discipline, and resistance, are as fascinating as they are unsettling. They remind us of a truth that transcends centuries, that beneath ritual and robe, the human heart beats with desires that no stone wall, no decree, and no vow can ever fully suppress. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. Our journey begins in Italy, a land where devotion and decadence walked hand in hand, and where convent walls sometimes concealed more than sacred prayer. Italy in the Middle Ages was a land of contradictions. It was the cradle of Renaissance brilliance and the seat of papal authority, but also a place where temptation and indulgence seemed to seep into every corner of life. Nowhere was this paradox more vividly seen than within the convents that dotted the Italian landscape. These were meant to be sacred institutions, homes of women who renounced the world to dedicate their lives to God. Yet many became infamous for something far different. Behind their stone walls, holiness was often overshadowed by scandal. Among all of Italy's cities, Venice stood apart. Venice was unlike any other, built upon water, masked by mystery, and fueled by trade and wealth that flowed in from across the seas. Known for its masquerades, its shadows, and its subtle blurring of morality, the city carried an allure of both elegance and intrigue. In this environment, where secrecy and pleasure went hand in hand, the convents became entangled in the city's unique culture. Accounts from the time suggest that convents in Venice, far from cloistered sanctuaries, sometimes functioned as clandestine brothels. The image seems almost unbelievable. Holy places, supposedly ruled by silence and prayer, transformed into hidden centers of desire. Men of influence, merchants, nobles, even clerics, were said to slip behind the heavy doors of abbeys not for spiritual guidance but for encounters with the women within. Descriptions from chroniclers paint scenes that are at once shocking and strangely theatrical. Some nuns, especially in Venice, were known to wear loose, short dresses, their necklines daringly low, even during the solemnity of church services. The beauty of these women was often remarked upon. Slender figures, graceful movements, eyes that held both innocence and seduction. It was a dangerous mixture, piety interlaced with sensuality, that drew men again and again to their doors. The Venetian abbeys, in this sense, became not just places of worship but bustling hubs of whispered rendezvous. In the book The Life and Work of Balthazar Casa, Alexander Paradisus vividly describes such episodes, recounting how the thin veil of religious discipline could not conceal the very human desires simmering beneath. The convents, far from being free of worldly temptations, became magnets for them. But it was not just physical beauty that drew men to these places. In Venice, a city where power and pleasure intertwined, the allure of the convent carried with it a sense of danger and secrecy. To cross the threshold was to enter forbidden territory, to indulge in sin not in the anonymity of a tavern or brothel, but within the very walls consecrated to God. It was this tension, this sense of daring, that magnified the allure. For some, it was less about desire itself and more about the thrill of transgression. Yet behind the sensational stories, there was also tragedy. Many women entered convents not out of genuine devotion but because they had little choice. Daughters of wealthy families were often sent to nunneries not for spiritual reasons but for practical ones. To preserve family fortunes, avoid costly dowries, or remove inconvenient heirs from inheritance disputes. For some of these young women, the convent was less a sanctuary than a prison. And within such confinement, where natural desires were suppressed and futures stolen, rebellion found its way in the most human of forms, through love, longing, and secret encounters. Italy's convents, and especially those of Venice, thus reveal more than scandalous tales. They reveal the cracks in medieval society itself. Behind the painted images of serene Madonnas and kneeling sisters lay a world where human desire, social control, and the lust for freedom intertwined in ways that neither church decree nor stone walls could fully contain. From Venice we move deeper into this paradox, for the next accounts show not just allure and secrecy but a complete blurring of the sacred and profane. A reminder that convent walls often reflected society's sins rather than shielding against them. The Venetian convents, more than perhaps any others in Europe, cultivated an image that seemed to deliberately straddle the line between devotion and seduction. Contemporary accounts describe nuns whose appearance would have startled the devout. Robes loosened, necklines daringly low, and dresses shorter than the modest church expected. At first glance, it may seem like exaggeration, the fevered invention of scandal seekers. Yet multiple sources from the time, from official inspections to eyewitness chronicles, confirm these details with unnerving regularity. Beauty in these convents was not merely incidental. It was cultivated, displayed, and in many cases sought after. The nuns of Venice were said to be among the most striking women of the city, slender, graceful, and poised, their youthful charm made even more magnetic by the aura of forbidden sanctity. To outsiders, it was as if innocence itself had been weaponized, cloaked in garments of devotion but charged with an undercurrent of sensuality. This allure did not go unnoticed. Venice, already a city of masks and intrigue, was a place where boundaries between the sacred and the profane blurred easily. The famous Venetian courtesans, admired for their wit, beauty, and sophistication, held positions of influence in society. The convent nuns, though in theory their opposite, came to embody a similar fascination. Both were women behind walls, one of velvet, the other of stone, yet both became objects of desire, shaping Venice's reputation as a city where temptation and mystery were as common as the tides of its canals. The abbeys of Venice thus became social centers in their own right. Men, sometimes of the highest rank, sought the company of the women within. These visits were not always secretive. Chroniclers suggest that convents, particularly those in affluent districts, were often bustling with visitors, wealthy patrons, nobles, and merchants slipping through doors that should have been closed to them. For some, it was a place of private indulgence. For others, it became a kind of unspoken social club, a meeting ground where whispered affairs and political alliances might be sealed in the same breath. Yet the convent's atmosphere of temptation was not born from rebellion alone. Many of the women inside had little agency over their lives. Sent into religious houses by families unwilling to pay expensive dowries, they were forced into vows they had never chosen. Behind the pious exterior, resentment and longing simmered. In such an environment, beauty and seduction became both a weapon and a form of survival. If a woman could not leave, she could at least carve out a life of influence, through the affection she attracted, the favors she won, and the secret power she wielded over men who believed themselves in control. The Venetian Republic itself seemed torn on how to deal with the matter. On the one hand, the city prided itself on its Catholic devotion, boasting some of the grandest churches in Europe. On the other, Venice had long been known as a place where pleasure was part of its identity, woven into its culture as naturally as trade and politics. To condemn the convents outright would have meant acknowledging the rot in institutions meant to embody purity. Instead, the Republic often turned a blind eye, occasionally issuing moral decrees but rarely enforcing them with vigor. It was a delicate balance between maintaining appearances and indulging the city's unspoken desires. And so, convents in Venice thrived in this ambiguous state, neither wholly sacred nor openly profane, but something in between. They were places where music drifted through chapel halls, where silk occasionally replaced wool, where beauty was both a sin and a currency. For the men who entered, it was a brush with the forbidden. For the women trapped inside, it was both rebellion and survival. Thus, Venetian convents became a mirror of the city itself, a place of shadows and light, secrecy and spectacle, where the promise of holiness masked a reality far more human and far more scandalous. If Venice epitomized seduction hidden behind masks and waterlogged walls, Spain's convents revealed an entirely different character, structured, named, and categorized in ways that betrayed both their notoriety and their strange acceptance within society. While Italy's nunneries gained infamy for their theatrical allure, Spain's carried labels so blunt they seemed almost like signposts announcing their transgressions. Chroniclers speak of convents in Spain that acquired peculiar titles, the Abbey of Doles, the Abbey of the Penitent Magdalens, and others whose very names carried suggestions of indulgence or repentance. Unlike in Venice, where scandal cloaked itself in elegance, Spanish convents seemed to wear their contradictions openly, as though society itself had grown accustomed to their reputation. It was as if each house of nuns had its own specialty, whispered among the men who frequented them. The monastic walls, meant to signify uniformity, instead reflected a marketplace of desires. This paradox becomes even sharper when placed against the broader backdrop of Spanish religiosity. Spain in the Middle Ages was a land marked by fervent Catholicism, later intensified by the iron grip of the Inquisition. The same culture that would scourge heretics, burn so-called witches, and police the thoughts of common people somehow permitted, and even tolerated, convents that became centers of scandal. The contradiction could not have been greater. Institutions meant to embody holiness reduced to symbols of temptation, and yet not entirely dismantled, as though the machinery of sin was too deeply embedded to be uprooted. But why did this flourish in Spain of all places? Some historians suggest that the intensity of Spain's religious repression created a natural countercurrent, a subterranean current of rebellion. Human beings, when pushed into extreme rigidity, often bend back the other way with equal force. Convents became the perfect outlet, enclosed spaces removed from prying eyes, but filled with women who had not chosen their fate. Daughters of noble families, discarded into cloisters to preserve wealth or political advantage, were not all destined for quiet devotion. Many harbored frustration, passion, and longing, and when opportunity presented itself they acted. The titles given to these convents were not official decrees from bishops but the mocking nicknames bestowed by men. A convent might be called after penitent Magdalens, suggesting both a biblical echo of sin and redemption, but in reality signaling to clients what sort of pleasures or personalities could be found within. These names stuck, filtering into rumor, song, and whispered stories across towns and villages. The very language of the convent shifted from sanctity to satire, a testament to how deeply embedded their reputation had become. And yet, the presence of these convents tells us something profound about Spanish society. They reveal a culture where holiness and sin coexisted in uneasy proximity, where the Church's power was absolute in doctrine but uneven in practice. Priests and bishops thundered about morality from the pulpit, while in shadowed corners, they themselves were often complicit in the very behavior they condemned. The convents of Spain were not merely anomalies, they were symptoms of a larger tension, the clash between the rigid ideals of faith and the unmovable truth of human desire. To walk past the walls of such a convent was to feel both reverence and suspicion. To enter its gates, as so many men did, was to step into a paradox, a place consecrated to the Virgin and yet filled with sins whispered of in taverns and courts alike. Spain's convents, with their strange names and stranger reputations, remain a reminder that even in a land of fire and faith, the human heart could not be wholly contained. The indulgence of Spain's convents could not go unchecked forever. Scandal after scandal piled upon itself until even the most tolerant authorities were forced to act. What began as whispers in taverns and muttered jokes in marketplaces grew into formal accusations, and soon the church hierarchy itself had no choice but to intervene. One of the most infamous cases involved a convent whose activities had become so excessive, so brazen, that the community itself demanded closure. Chroniclers describe how its reputation had spread beyond the city's borders, leaving noble families embarrassed, clergy scandalized, and townsfolk outraged. The scandal reached such heights that the convent was permanently shut down. Its remaining nuns were not set free but instead transferred to the stern guardianship of St. Laurentius, where their daily lives were monitored with near military discipline. The hope was that stricter rules and unrelenting surveillance might finally extinguish the flame of temptation that had burned so brightly within their walls. But this so-called solution speaks volumes about the mindset of the time. Punishment rarely meant liberation for these women. It meant control, stripping away what little autonomy they might have carved for themselves. The church and secular authorities did not seek to understand why such transgressions occurred, nor did they acknowledge that these convents had become hotbeds of rebellion precisely because women were forced into them against their will. Instead, the narrative of sin and discipline was reinforced. Fallen sisters must be watched, guarded, and contained like dangerous prisoners. The irony, of course, was that this rigid approach often produced the opposite of what it intended. By intensifying surveillance and punishment, the church heightened the sense of oppression, which in turn fueled further rebellion. A young woman condemned to a convent for life without her choosing might accept her fate in silence, or she might look for any chance, however dangerous, to seize back a fragment of joy, even at the risk of scandal. The more walls were built, the more desperate the desire to breach them. There are records of Spanish convents where groups of nuns were paraded in front of tribunals, publicly shamed for unchaste behavior. Their names were recorded, their reputations permanently stained, and yet the cycle continued. For every convent shuttered, another would quietly take its place, continuing the uneasy dance of repression and indulgence. The case of St. Leonard's is particularly telling. Instead of disbanding the convent and freeing the women, the church placed them under the direct supervision of another house, as if morality could be restored by proximity to discipline. But history shows that morality is not enforced by rules alone. Human longing is a force that does not vanish with threats. It merely hides, waiting for its chance to resurface. This clash between punishment and desire revealed the heart of the problem in Spain. Institutions built on ideals of purity were colliding with the messy, uncontainable reality of human passion. The church could close convent doors, relocate women, and issue punishments, but it could not erase the desires that drove these stories in the first place. And so, Spain's convent scandals remain more than isolated tales of misbehavior. They expose the fragile balance between repression and rebellion, reminding us that attempts to crush the human spirit often create the very scandals authorities most fear. The scandals of Spain, like those of Italy before them, lead us to a larger question, one that stretches beyond convent walls and into the heart of human experience. Why do places designed to embody holiness so often become theaters of sin? Why, in the very spaces where vows of chastity, obedience, and humility were recited, do we find indulgence, defiance, and excess? The answer lies not only in corruption or weakness, but in something far more universal, the unyielding pull of human nature. For centuries, the church constructed monastic life as the highest form of devotion, asking men and women to renounce the world, suppress their desires, and devote themselves wholly to God. Yet repression does not erase desire, it only buries it deeper. And what is buried does not wither, it ferments, grows, and eventually erupts. The convent scandals reveal this truth with startling clarity. Many of the women who entered these institutions did so without choice. They were daughters of noble houses forced into cloisters to protect family fortunes, orphans without dowries, or inconvenient heirs removed from inheritance disputes. Their vows, more often than not, were born of compulsion rather than conviction. Once inside, stripped of freedom and told that obedience was their only virtue, these women found themselves caught between duty and the natural longings of the human heart. Some turned inward, losing themselves in prayer. Others turned outward, seizing whatever fragments of desire and rebellion they could grasp. The church, for its part, responded with rules, inspections, and punishments, believing discipline alone could conquer temptation. But history shows a different pattern. The stricter the confinement, the more inventive the rebellion. Forbidden love letters slipped through cracks in convent walls, visitors bribed guards, secret encounters arranged in cloisters by night. The more tightly the hand of authority tried to close, the more easily desire slipped through its fingers. This is not merely a story of medieval women rebelling against vows. It is a mirror reflecting a timeless truth. Human beings are not built for absolute suppression. Whether in monasteries or in palaces, in the Middle Ages or in modern times, attempts to deny the essence of human longing often lead to its most dramatic expression. The convents, in this sense, became microcosms of human struggle. They were stages where the eternal battle between piety and passion, control and freedom, holiness and humanity played out in raw and often shocking ways. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this: the scandals that filled the walls of convents were not deviations from human nature, but expressions of it. They remind us that behind every robe, every vow, and every ritual beats a heart that cannot be silenced by decree. From Italy to Spain, we have seen how repression and temptation collided. But to truly understand how deep this paradox ran, we must turn to France, the so-called land of love, where convent walls witnessed not just private affairs, but full-scale festivals of indulgence that rivaled the wildest celebrations of ancient Rome. If Italy's convents were whispered about and Spain's were mockingly named, France's scandals were something else entirely: lavish, unrestrained, and carried out with a theatrical flair that seemed uniquely French. This was, after all, the land of troubadours and poetry, of courtly love and passionate indulgence. In such a culture, even convent life could not escape the gravitational pull of desire. Chroniclers tell us that French nunneries, particularly those in and around Paris, became known for something that sounds closer to a pagan festival than a Christian devotion: bacchanalia. Fueled by wine, laughter, and unbridled energy, these gatherings resembled the ancient Roman revels dedicated to Bacchus, the god of ecstasy and wine. The very halls meant for prayer were transformed into playgrounds of excess, filled with music, dancing, and bodies intertwined in shadows. The rules of the monasteries were clear: strict bans forbade nuns from participating in such feasts, let alone indulging in their excesses. Yet the records are equally clear: those bans were ignored. The French church fathers, alarmed at the reports of debauchery, issued repeated decrees forbidding nuns from attending or hosting such orgies. But the ink of prohibition seemed powerless against the fire of temptation. Nearly 3 decades after the first ban was written, it had to be reissued, word for word, as if the first had been little more than parchment smoke. Even official documents of the era betray the scale of these scandals. Reports describe events known in chillingly direct terms as the worship of the phallus and mad holidays. Imagine the shock of a devout Christian reading such words in the records of their holy institutions. The language itself suggests not just misbehavior, but a kind of ritualized, communal rebellion, a deliberate turning of sacred space into the stage for forbidden celebration. Why France? Why here, in the very heart of Catholic Europe, did convents become sites of wild abandon? Part of the answer lies in the culture of the time. Paris was a city of contrasts. Devout pilgrims flocked to its grand cathedrals, while just streets away taverns roared with drunken song. Courtly love flourished in poetry, where passion was praised as a noble pursuit rather than a shameful indulgence. In such an atmosphere, the boundary between piety and pleasure was thin, easily crossed, and often deliberately blurred. And let us not forget that many nuns themselves came from noble families steeped in the same traditions of song, feasting, and romance. To expect them to suddenly abandon all traces of their upbringing the moment they entered a convent was unrealistic. Instead, many carried those traditions inside with them, reshaping cloisters into places where suppressed desires erupted in the form of extravagant celebration. The bacchanalia of French convents were not merely scandals of flesh. They were cultural expressions of a society where pleasure and holiness were locked in constant tension. The Church sought to clamp down, but in doing so only underscored the irresistible allure of indulgence. For every decree of silence, there was a louder song. For every rule of fasting, there was another feast. France, the land of poets and lovers, lived up to its reputation even within convent walls. And what unfolded there would shock not just the faithful, but even hardened bishops who came to investigate. Among the most disturbing accounts from medieval France are the records that speak not just of secret affairs or drunken feasts, but of ceremonies that took on an unmistakably pagan character. These were not isolated lapses of discipline. They were organized, repeated, and documented with terms that would have horrified the faithful. In official reports preserved by bishops and chroniclers, certain convent gatherings were explicitly described as the worship of the phallus and mad holidays. The words strike like a thunderclap across the centuries, direct, unembellished, and deeply revealing. They suggest that what took place within convent walls was not merely spontaneous indulgence, but ritualized celebrations, where the very symbols of chastity and purity were inverted into emblems of passion and rebellion. To modern ears, the notion seems grotesque, but to medieval society, it carried an even deeper shock. The phallus, long associated with fertility cults and pagan rites, had no place in the sanctified rituals of the Church. Yet here it was, resurrected inside institutions dedicated to the Virgin Mary, a collision of sacred and profane so stark it defied comprehension. Historians debate the extent of these rites. Were they exaggerated by outraged bishops, or were they truly practiced with fervor? What is certain is that the Church treated the reports with deadly seriousness. The repetition of bans, decade after decade, indicates that these gatherings did not vanish with a single decree. They persisted, suggesting that beneath the Christian veneer of France, remnants of older traditions still smoldered. Pagan festivals, long suppressed, may have found new expression in the hidden world of the convent. It is not hard to imagine how this could happen. Medieval Europe, especially in rural regions, still retained echoes of pre-Christian practices, harvest rituals, fertility festivals, and superstitions tied to the cycles of the earth. For women forced into convents, cut off from choice and often from joy, the act of reviving such ceremonies may have been both rebellion and release. It was a way to reclaim a sense of power and pleasure in a life otherwise dictated by silence and obedience. The phrase "mad holidays" captures the essence. Moments when order dissolved, when the rigid structures of prayer and penance gave way to chaos and freedom. Wine flowed, laughter rang, and the women who were expected to embody purity instead embraced the raw vitality of desire. It was dangerous, forbidden, and intoxicating precisely because it defied everything their world demanded of them. And yet, these rituals also reveal a deeper truth, that even in the heart of Christian Europe, pagan symbols and passions were never fully extinguished. They lingered, hidden in folklore, whispered in villages and, astonishingly, in the cloisters of Parisian convents. For the bishops who uncovered these practices, the sight must have been both terrifying and enraging. To them it was not merely sin, it was heresy, a corruption of the faith from within. For the nuns, it was something else entirely. A brief, dangerous taste of liberation, a night where the veil of obedience was cast aside, and the ancient fire of human longing burned freely once more. In the year 1245, a figure of solemn authority stepped quietly into the cloisters of Paris. Bishop Odo, charged with inspecting the state of the city's monasteries and convents, expected to find discipline, silence, and devotion. What he uncovered instead shook him, and would ripple through the church as one of the most unsettling revelations of the age. Odo's reports, preserved in fragments, describe scenes that read more like the chronicles of a festival than the records of holy houses. The women who had vowed to live as brides of Christ were indulging openly in forbidden pleasures. Their celebrations were not hidden whispers or private sins. They were grand, collective affairs. Wine and song filled the cloisters, and the boundaries between ritual and revelry blurred until little distinction remained. He noted with horror that the bans imposed decades earlier had done nothing. The nuns, far from quailing under the threat of ecclesiastical punishment, seemed emboldened by it. Decrees had been issued, scoldings delivered, and penalties threatened, but the indulgence continued as if the very act of disobedience added to the thrill. By the time Odo visited, the bacchanalia had become so entrenched that even his presence could not fully quell them. Imagine the weight of his realization, that convents, which ought to have stood as bastions of discipline in the heart of Christendom, had instead become spaces of defiance. These were not isolated lapses, but habits ingrained into the life of certain houses. The very women entrusted to embody purity were instead living in ways that mocked the sacred vows they had been forced to take. Yet beneath his outrage lies another story, one Odo may not have intended to tell. His records reveal not only scandal but also resistance. Many of these women had been confined since girlhood, stripped of choice and thrust into roles they had not desired. Their indulgence, however shocking, can also be read as rebellion. It was a way to reclaim ownership of their bodies, to assert their humanity in the face of structures that sought to deny it. And so Odo's revelations do more than expose scandal. They illuminate a profound tension at the core of medieval society. The church could command obedience, but it could not erase desire. It could impose vows, but it could not control the soul's yearning for freedom. The bishop's visit ended with stern reports, warnings, and renewed bans. But history shows us the futility of his efforts. Even as new decrees were penned, the music of forbidden feasts would rise again behind convent walls, echoing through the centuries as proof that the human heart is not easily silenced. From Odo's revelations we move deeper into France's most shocking example, a convent whose very existence blurred the line between piety and prostitution, and whose operations were sanctioned at the highest levels of power. By the mid-14th century, the line between piety and corruption in France's convents grew so blurred that it seemed almost impossible to tell the difference. Yet one case stands out as extraordinary, not merely for its scandal but because it was sanctioned at the highest levels of society. At the request of Queen Joan herself, a special monastery was created, one that revealed just how deeply the sacred could be twisted to serve both power and desire. The decree sounded righteous on the surface. All harlots and promiscuous virgins, women accused of moral corruption, were to be stripped naked and confined within a specially designated convent. The official justification was redemption. Here, removed from the temptations of the outside world, these women would atone for their sins before God. It was presented as an act of mercy, a chance for the fallen to purify themselves and return to grace. But behind closed doors, the reality was far more shocking. This convent was no sanctuary, it was a brothel in all but name, sanctioned by royal command. The abbess within acted as a kind of overseer, determining which clients would be admitted and assigning them to particular cells. Men of rank and wealth found easy passage into its halls, where the women, cloaked in the appearance of nuns, were expected to serve not their faith, but the carnal appetites of those who held power over them. Unlike ordinary brothels, however, the women inside this so-called convent had no freedom. They were not courtesans who wielded influence or earned wealth from their patrons. Instead, they were captives, bound by both royal decree and religious pretense. There was no choice, no payment, no agency. Their lives, already judged as wayward, were now conscripted into a system that exploited their bodies under the guise of penitence. The creation of such a monastery reveals the deep hypocrisy of the age. At a time when ordinary women could be condemned as heretics for the slightest deviation from social norms, the queen herself could establish an institution that turned sin into ritual, corruption into commerce. It was a grotesque marriage of sanctity and exploitation, where religious symbols were weaponized to mask one of society's darkest practices. And yet, perhaps what is most unsettling is how ordinary this arrangement became. Chroniclers note that the brothel convent operated openly, its existence acknowledged, its rules enforced not in secrecy but in plain sight of those who benefited from it. It was a public secret, known, tolerated, and even patronized by the very elites who claimed to defend the sanctity of Christian morals. This special monastery reminds us that scandal was not always rebellion against authority. Sometimes, scandal was woven into the very fabric of authority itself. Sometimes, it was the crown, not the cloister, that corrupted what was sacred. From this shocking example, we must step deeper still, into the private operations of the convent brothel itself, where women lived under inspection, where freedom was stripped away entirely, and where faith was reduced to a thin veil over exploitation. The so-called special monastery in France was not a place of repentance at all, but a systematized brothel operating under the cloak of religious sanctity. Behind its stone walls, the abbess wielded authority like a madam in a house of vice. It was she who determined which clients could enter, who would be granted an audience with the women inside, and which chamber, or cell, would serve as the stage for the encounter. What should have been sacred spaces of prayer became little more than chambers of exploitation. The women themselves, stripped of their freedom and dignity, had no agency in this arrangement. Unlike courtesans of the time, who, for all their precarious positions, could at least wield a degree of influence, attract wealthy patrons, and sometimes climb into circles of culture and power, the women confined here had none of those liberties. They were not free to refuse. They could not negotiate. And most damningly, they received no compensation. Their bodies were used under the guise of atonement, but in truth they were little more than captives in a royal-sanctioned system of exploitation. To add to this grotesque distortion, the convent implemented regular examinations of the women. Ostensibly, these inspections were meant to prevent the spread of disease, an ever-present threat in medieval brothels. But there was no genuine concern for the health or well-being of the women themselves. Instead, these checks served the interests of the men who visited, ensuring that their indulgences would not carry unwanted consequences. The women's suffering was secondary to the preservation of a corrupt economy of pleasure masked as penitence. Imagine the despair of those within. Many had been cast into the convent as punishment, their reputations already ruined, their names already blackened in society. To the outside world, they were women, atoning for their sins. Yet in reality they were trapped in a cycle from which there was no redemption, condemned to live as both prisoners and objects of desire, their faith turned against them, their sanctity rewritten as scandal. This institution embodies the darkest paradox of medieval Europe, that power could take what was sacred, twist it into something profane, and still justify it beneath the language of holiness. It was not an isolated hypocrisy but a deeply entrenched one, woven into the structures of crown and church alike. The convent brothel's very existence forces us to confront a sobering truth. These women were not simply victims of desire, they were victims of a system that exploited sin while publicly condemning it. Their suffering reveals the depth of corruption in an age when morality was preached with fervor but practiced with deceit. And yet, history shows that even this twisted arrangement would one day collapse, not through moral awakening but through the brutal arrival of disease, when indulgence itself would unleash consequences too devastating to ignore. The story of France's convent brothels might have continued unchecked for generations had it not been for an enemy more relentless than any bishop's decree or royal edict. It was not the pulpit that silenced these houses of indulgence, but disease, an invisible scourge that swept across Europe with devastating force. In the late Middle Ages, syphilis emerged as one of the most feared epidemics. It spread rapidly, cutting across class and status, striking soldiers, merchants, nobles, and clergy alike. Its effects were horrifying: sores, madness, slow death. To societies already scarred by plague, famine, and war, syphilis carried an especially damning mark: it was explicitly linked to sexuality. To contract the disease was to bear visible proof of indulgence, a stigma that no prayer could easily erase. Within the walls of France's scandalous convents, the epidemic struck like a hammer blow. The very institutions that had thrived on secrecy and indulgence suddenly became breeding grounds of contagion. No examination or control could contain it. What had once been whispered rumors of sin now erupted into visible consequences. The church could ignore whispers, but it could not ignore sores that spread through entire communities, nor the rising death toll that accompanied them. The syphilis epidemic forced a reckoning. Convents once tolerated as unspoken diversions for powerful men now became liabilities, their reputations irreparably stained not just by scandal but by association with disease. The crown, the clergy, and even the broader populace could no longer look away. In a society already obsessed with divine punishment, syphilis was interpreted as God's judgment on unholy living. The logic was unavoidable. If convents had become dens of indulgence, then the epidemic was heaven's retribution. It is worth noting that this shift was not born of compassion for the women trapped inside. Few voices spoke of their suffering, of their loss of choice, of the exploitation that had defined their lives. Instead, the closures and crackdowns were motivated by fear. Fear of contagion, fear of divine wrath, fear of reputational ruin. In the end, it was not morality that ended France's carnal convents, it was survival. The collapse of these institutions reveals how fragile their existence truly was. They could endure scandal, hypocrisy, and exploitation so long as those sins were hidden behind cloistered walls. But when sin carried consequences that spread beyond the convent, when bodies themselves bore the scars of indulgence, the illusion shattered. And so, with the rise of syphilis, many of France's most notorious convents closed their doors. Some faded into silence, their histories buried under layers of official denial. Others lived on in whispered memory, their names etched into scandalous chronicles that survive even now. Together, they stand as reminders of how quickly society turns, not when confronted with injustice, but when confronted with consequences it can no longer afford to ignore. With France's scandals silenced by epidemic, our journey now turns north to Germany, a land whose response to convent corruption was unlike that of Italy, Spain, or France. Where others indulged, tolerated, or reluctantly suppressed, Germany imposed punishment with a severity that reveals both its cultural rigor and its determination to enforce order at any cost. If Italy reveled in temptation, Spain mocked its own convents with notorious nicknames, and France descended into ritualized indulgence, Germany's story takes a different turn. Here, in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, scandals within convent walls were not merely whispered about, they were met with punishment so swift and severe that it reveals much about the German character of the age. Unlike Venice, where secrecy and decadence were woven into the culture, or France, where excess was almost theatrical, German authorities prided themselves on discipline and order. When convents strayed, their misconduct was treated not only as sin but as a threat to social stability. And the punishments imposed reflected a society determined to stamp out corruption through fear. Take for example the Sorbian Jura region. Nadenzell Abbey, once intended as a home of devotion, had by the late Middle Ages become little more than a brothel in all but name. Its doors were open day and night, welcoming men who could afford the company of the nuns within. Word of its operations spread quickly, and what might have remained a local scandal soon reached the ears of Duke Julius of Brunswick, a patron of the convent and a man known for his uncompromising authority. The duke's response was brutal. With personal orders, he commanded that the Mother Superior, the very woman entrusted with guiding her sisters, be sealed alive within the walls of the abbey itself. To him, her leadership had not only failed but had actively corrupted the institution. The act of walling her in, entombing her within the very stones that were supposed to signify sanctity, was both punishment and symbol. Sin was to be buried, literally, out of sight. This chilling fate, though extreme, was not an isolated gesture. German church authorities followed with systematic inspections of convents, determined to root out misconduct before it could spread. The results of these visitations were often shocking. At Cephalingen Abbey, for instance, inspectors reported that a majority of the nuns were pregnant, a scandal so profound it could not be concealed. These findings confirmed the suspicions of bishops and nobles alike. The cloistered life, when corrupted, was capable of shocking excess, and the German response was to expose and punish without mercy. What makes Germany's approach distinct is not only the severity of the punishments but the rationale behind them. Where Venice might have turned a blind eye for the sake of pleasure and profit, and where France tolerated until disease forced closure, Germany believed that order itself was at stake. A convent was not merely a private house of women but part of the moral fabric of society. If it fell into corruption, the stain spread beyond its walls, undermining both the church's authority and the stability of the realm. And so, Germany's convent scandals, while just as sensational as those of its neighbors, stand out for the starkness of their resolution. Discipline came not through half-hearted decrees but through walls, inspections, and punishments that shocked even contemporaries. In their determination to restore order, German rulers revealed both the iron fist of their governance and the deep fear that unchecked indulgence might corrode the very foundation of faith and society. But even within this culture of severity, some convents did not merely fall into scandal. They reinvented themselves into something darker, serving not just common men but the nobility itself. And within those walls, indulgence took on a theatrical, almost sinister form. Few punishments in history capture both the brutality and the symbolism of medieval justice as vividly as the fate of the Mother Superior of Nadenzell Abbey. Her story, preserved in fragments of chronicles and local lore, remains one of the most chilling testaments to how Germany sought to deal with scandal inside convent walls. By the time Duke Julius of Brunswick intervened, Nadenzell Abbey was no longer seen as a house of prayer but as an open brothel, its reputation known across the region. The women within had become the subject of gossip, scandal, and outrage, but to the Duke, the greatest sin lay with their leader. The Mother Superior, entrusted with guiding her sisters toward obedience and devotion, was judged not merely as negligent but as actively complicit. In the eyes of authority, she had turned a holy house into a house of shame. The punishment was swift, merciless, and laden with symbolism. By Duke Julius's direct order, the abbess was walled in alive within the convent itself. Stone by stone, masons sealed her into a narrow chamber, her prayers, or her screams, echoing against the same walls that had once been meant to protect her. There was no trial, no chance for repentance. Her living entombment was both execution and warning, a message to every nun, priest, and patron that corruption within the church would not be tolerated. To modern readers, the act seems barbaric. Yet in the medieval imagination, it carried a powerful symbolism. Walling in a sinner within sacred grounds was more than punishment. It was a ritual of purification. By burying the source of corruption inside the very stones of the abbey, the Duke sought to restore holiness to the space. Sin was not merely condemned, it was physically contained, entombed, as if sealing it away could cleanse the institution itself. But there is a darker irony in this act. For while the abbess was entombed as the embodiment of sin, the structures of power that had allowed Nadenzell to decay remained untouched. Noble patrons who had frequented its halls were not punished. Priests who turned a blind eye were spared. Authority always fell hardest on the women inside, especially their leaders, who bore the full weight of scandal while the men who enabled it walked free. The story of the walled-in Mother Superior is unsettling not only for its cruelty but for what it reveals about society's hunger for symbolic justice. The abbess's fate did not address the deeper causes of convent scandals, forced vows, lack of freedom, and the hypocrisy of the powerful. Instead, it offered a spectacle, a dramatic gesture meant to reassure the public that order had been restored. In truth, nothing had been solved. The desires that fueled the scandals continued to simmer in other convents, and new stories of excess and corruption would surface again. But the abbess's entombment lived on as legend, a grim reminder of the price of failing to maintain the illusion of holiness. From this macabre act, we move to the inspections that followed, where German bishops uncovered even more startling revelations. Convents where vows of chastity had all but vanished, and where scandal took forms that shocked even hardened investigators. The fate of the entombed Mother Superior was only the beginning. In the wake of Nadenzell Abbey's disgrace, German authorities intensified their inspections, determined to expose every trace of corruption festering inside convent walls. What they found shocked even those hardened by years of ecclesiastical scandals. At Cephalingen Abbey, the revelations were staggering. Inspectors reported that the majority of the nuns were pregnant, a discovery that turned whispers into undeniable proof. These were not isolated lapses or secret affairs, but a collective breakdown of the vows that were meant to bind the women to chastity. For the bishops recording the events, it was more than moral failure. It was a humiliation of the church itself, proof that within these supposedly sacred walls, human desire had not only crept in but flourished. The scandal spread quickly, and its implications were devastating. To the faithful, the sight of pregnant nuns represented the collapse of all that was holy. To the authorities, it was a sign that convents were no longer functioning as instruments of discipline, but as theaters of rebellion and indulgence. Yet once again the question arises, who truly bore the blame? The records name the women, but the men, nobles, clerics, patrons, were rarely punished. The imbalance was stark, exposing the deep hypocrisy of a system that condemned the powerless while shielding the powerful. Among the most curious cases unearthed during these investigations was St. Eberhard's monastery in Oberndorf. Unlike Cephalingen, where scandal unfolded in chaos, St. Eberhard's operated with chilling structure. It was known as a brothel for the nobility, catering exclusively to the wealthy and well-born. About 20 nuns resided there, but their role was not to pray, it was to entertain. The convent became a private playground for the elite, a place where indulgence could be sought away from public scrutiny. What set St. Eberhard's apart was the theatricality of its excesses. Chroniclers describe feasts where wine flowed endlessly, where music filled the air, and where at a certain moment, the candles were suddenly extinguished. Darkness fell upon the hall, and in that shadow, the nuns and their noble guests indulged freely, unbound by sight, identity, or restraint. It was a ritual of chaos, a game of desire cloaked in secrecy, where the sacred institution of the convent dissolved into little more than a stage for aristocratic pleasure. The existence of such a place reveals much about the social fabric of medieval Germany. Convents, rather than standing apart from the world, were often enmeshed within its hierarchies. They became tools for the powerful, places to deposit unwanted daughters, yes, but also spaces where nobles could indulge desires without fear of exposure. For the women trapped inside, this meant lives shaped not by faith, but by the whims of men whose wealth insulated them from consequence. Pregnant nuns, noble brothels, feasts in the dark. These stories strip away the illusion of sanctity and reveal the convents as battlegrounds where power, repression, and desire collided. They force us to question not just the vows of the women, but the deeper structures of authority that turned holy places into theaters of scandal. And yet, even as Germany sought to enforce order, these revelations showed that human nature could not be erased by punishment alone. For every wall built, for every inspection ordered, desire found another way. The struggle between discipline and indulgence was far from over. From these revelations, we move into the heart of these night feasts themselves. Moments when darkness was not merely absence of light, but the stage upon which chaos and secrecy reigned. The scandal of St. Eberhard's monastery in Oberndorf reached its most disturbing expression in what contemporaries called the games in the dark. Chroniclers, often reluctant to describe such acts in detail, nonetheless left behind enough fragments to piece together a picture of these strange, ritualized indulgences. They were not casual lapses or fleeting moments of weakness. They were carefully staged spectacles designed to blur every boundary between sacredness and sin, order and chaos. The feast would begin as any other gathering might in a noble hall. Long tables draped with linen, goblets filled with wine, platters of roasted meat, the air thick with music and laughter. Nuns, who should have been cloistered in prayer, were instead central to the scene, moving among their guests, entertaining them with smiles, conversation, and subtle touches that carried unspoken promises. To those outside the convent walls, it would have seemed like a celebration of aristocrats. Within, it was something more intimate, more dangerous. At the height of the evening, when wine had loosened inhibitions and the hall was filled with energy, the abbess, or sometimes even one of the noble guests, would give the signal. Suddenly the candles were snuffed out, plunging the room into complete darkness. Silence fell for a moment, broken only by nervous laughter. And then, as if a spell had been cast, chaos erupted. In the safety of shadows, identities dissolved, rules disappeared, and every boundary of propriety collapsed. Men and women reached out blindly, finding one another in the dark. The very absence of light became a license, a permission to indulge without shame or consequence. In that blackened hall, There were no vows, no titles, no sanctity, only desire. What happened in those moments remained unspoken when the lights were rekindled, but the chroniclers leave little doubt that the games were orgies in all but name. It is tempting to dismiss such accounts as exaggerations, perhaps the invention of hostile reformers eager to discredit the church. But the consistency of the reports, appearing across multiple sources and regions, suggests otherwise. And beyond their sensational detail, these stories carry symbolic weight. The extinguishing of light, the embrace of shadow. These acts were not only physical but also profoundly symbolic. They inverted the Christian metaphor of light as purity and darkness as sin. Here, darkness was liberation, the space where the forbidden could be safely enacted. For the nobles who participated, these games offered more than pleasure. They were also performances of power. To take the sacred space of a monastery and transform it into a theater of indulgence was an assertion that wealth and rank could bend even the holiest of institutions to their will. The convent, meant to be untouchable, became instead a private stage where authority and desire merged. For the nuns, the experience was more complicated. Some, no doubt, participated willingly, seizing the games as a form of rebellion against vows imposed without consent. Others, however, would have had little choice, bound by fear of punishment or the weight of authority pressing down upon them. In either case, their lives were shaped by forces far beyond their control, their identities caught between sacred duty and exploitation. The games in the dark leave us with an unsettling image. A holy house plunged into shadow, not just literally but morally, as silence and secrecy became shields for indulgence. They remind us that scandal was not always hidden in corners. It was sometimes performed openly, theatrically, and with the blessing of those who held power. From these ritualized feasts, we turn to the broader question of how German authorities attempted to curb such indulgences. If punishments had already reached extremes like walling in abysses, what more could be done to impose order on institutions that seemed determined to rebel? By the late Middle Ages, Germany's convent scandals had become impossible to ignore. From abbeys with pregnant nuns to noble brothels disguised as monasteries, the revelations were so widespread that they threatened not just the church's reputation but the very moral authority of society itself. The German response was harsh, uncompromising, and deeply characteristic of a culture that prized order above indulgence. Authorities moved quickly to impose new restrictions. First came decrees forbidding nuns from entering cities without direct supervision. The logic was simple. If the women could not mingle with townsfolk, they would have fewer opportunities for secret liaisons. In some regions, nuns who dared to appear in marketplaces or festivals without permission were fined or subjected to public penance. The goal was not only to restrict their movements but to shame them into obedience. But the laws did not stop at women. Men who entered convents with sinful intentions faced fines as well, a recognition that indulgence required more than willing nuns, it required enablers. Yet the punishments were rarely equal. A nun might face exile, lifelong penance, or even physical punishment, while her male counterpart often paid a sum and walked away. The imbalance was striking, exposing once again how society punished women as the guardians of morality while allowing men far more freedom in their sins. Inspections became more rigorous. Bishops and their agents would arrive unannounced at convents, demanding to see the women, questioning their habits and searching for evidence of scandal. These visitations were often humiliating, stripping the convent of its privacy and forcing the sisters to live under a cloud of constant suspicion. While some inspections revealed real abuses, others were little more than performances of authority, designed to remind the women of their powerlessness. The severity of these measures reflected a larger truth about medieval Germany. It was a society that saw discipline not as an option but as a necessity. Disorder in a convent was not just a personal failing but a threat to the moral fabric of the realm. If nuns, symbols of purity, could fall, what hope was there for the rest of society? The stricter the response, the more officials could reassure themselves that order had been restored. And yet, for all their severity, these measures rarely eradicated the scandals entirely. Human desire is not extinguished by fines or walls. It adapts, hides, and resurfaces. For every convent closed, another found ways to bend the rules. For every nun punished, another sought freedom and secrecy. German authorities might have been more relentless than their Italian or French counterparts, but they too discovered the limits of control. What these measures reveal most clearly is the enduring paradox of medieval religious life. Institutions built to embody holiness were constantly undermined by the very humanity they sought to suppress. The harder authorities clamped down, the more vividly rebellion flared. And in the process, Convents became not just places of scandal but symbols of a deeper struggle between freedom and control, passion and discipline, the individual and the institution. From Germany's stern attempts at control, we arrive at the final reflection: what all these stories scattered across Europe truly mean. Were these convent scandals merely moral failings, or do they tell us something far deeper about the human heart and its refusal to be silenced? From the brothels disguised as convents in Venice to the scandalous Abbey of Penitent Magdalens in Spain, from the Bacchanalian feasts of Paris to the noble brothel of Oberndorf, the stories we have traced across Europe reveal more than isolated tales of corruption. They reveal the deep tension between human desire and institutional control, between the ideals of holiness and the irrepressible force of the human heart. It is tempting to look back with judgment, to dismiss these scandals as proof of hypocrisy or weakness. Yet history is rarely that simple. For many of these women, convent life was not a choice but a sentence. They were daughters cast off to preserve family fortunes, widows without dowries, or girls deemed inconvenient by powerful men. Forced into vows they had never wanted, many found themselves imprisoned within walls built not of faith, but of social necessity. In that prison, desire became both rebellion and survival. The Church, faced with this reality, responded as it always did, with decrees, punishments, inspections, and shame. But again and again, it discovered the limits of authority. Walls could be built, abbesses entombed, bans reissued, but desire did not vanish. It seeped into the cracks, resurfaced in whispers, and erupted in spectacles of defiance. The scandals remind us of something timeless: that human longing cannot be erased by force. It can only be reshaped, hidden, or transformed, but never truly silenced. And there is irony here, almost tragic. The very institutions designed to embody purity became mirrors of the society around them. Society's indulgences, hypocrisies, and passions echoed within cloistered halls. If Venice was a city of masks, its convents too wore masks of piety. If Spain thrived on tension between repression and rebellion, its convents embodied the same struggle. If France celebrated romance and passion, its nunneries echoed with bacchanalian laughter. If Germany prized discipline, it turned punishment itself into spectacle. In the end, the convent scandals of medieval Europe are not merely about nuns who broke their vows. They are about the eternal clash between ideals and reality, between the divine order institutions sought to impose and the messy, uncontrollable humanity that lived within them. They remind us that history is not the story of saints alone, but of flawed, yearning people caught in systems larger than themselves. When we walk today through the ruins of old abbeys, when we see the serene faces of nuns depicted in medieval paintings, we might be tempted to believe in the purity of that world. But beneath the brushstrokes, behind the crumbling walls, there lingers another story, one of laughter in the dark, of whispered names, of forbidden love, of punishment and survival. It is this story that refuses to be buried, reminding us that even in the most sacred spaces, humanity remains, longing, rebelling, desiring, and forever beyond the reach of total control.